weird night in the West Wing. Let's play hardball. Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews in Washington. Tonight, as we meet, the mood in the office of the American presidency is grim and chaotic. The New York Times is reporting the chief of staff is offering to resign. The communications chief is in danger, and the White House secretary is gone altogether. President Trump publicly addressed the growing West Wing scandal for the first time today, defending the former aide who's been accused by two ex-wives of violent behavior.
We certainly wish him well. It's a obviously tough time for him. He did a very good job when he was in the White House, and we hope he has a wonderful career, and hopefully he will have a great career ahead of him. But it was very sad when we heard about it, and certainly he's also very sad. Now, he also, as you probably know, he says he's innocent. And I think you have to remember that. He said very strongly yesterday that he's innocent. So you'll have to talk to him about that. But we absolutely wish him well. Did a very good job while he was at the White House.
Well, notice what President Trump never mentioned. There is not one single word about either of the women accusing Rob Porter of abuse. And one of his ex-wives, Jennifer Willoughby, was on the Today Show this morning. She recounted one violent episode. Let's watch.
We had been fighting, and Rob followed me to the shower and pulled me out of the shower to continue the rage, and immediately saw how scared I was and recognized what he was doing and released it. But that was a moment when I realized he didn't have control.
You got a restraining order against him, so you feared some physical
It was a
violence?
temporary protective order after an incident where he had punched in the door of our home during our separation.
Well, Porter has called the allegations against him by his two ex-wives outrageous and false. Meanwhile, according to NBC News, President Donald Trump, frustrated by his staff's handling of the abuse allegations against Rob Porter, is increasingly venting about Chief of Staff John Kelly and speculating about potential replacements, according to multiple sources familiar with the matter. Well, the New York Times reported also among the people the president called to express dissatisfaction, according to those close to him, was none other than Reince Priebus. In an interview with Hugh Hewitt today, Priebus denied that account, saying, "The president has never complained to me about General Kelly." Well, the president's anger isn't just directed at Kelly. NBC reported he's also frustrated over Communications Director Hope Hicks's role in the Porter controversy. Hicks is reportedly in a relationship with Rob Porter, and also tonight, the New York Times is reporting that Kelly told White House officials he's willing to step down over his handling of the Porter news. Sources tell NBC News he has not made a formal offer to resign. For more on all this, I'm joined by NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Hallie Jackson, White House, or rather Washington Post Bureau Chief Phil Rucker, he's the White House Bureau Chief, and Jason Johnson, who's politics editor at The Root. Hallie, I've been waiting for hours to hear from you about just the sense that you can only get when you're near something. And is there a sense with the chief offering to resign, the communications chief in danger, the secretary gone? What is the feeling, and then what's the noise, the chatter level, and the mood over there now?
A lot of slammed doors, a lot of serious faces, Chris, is what we saw for most of the afternoon. And let me just go back a couple of steps, because you put up that headline from the New York Times that the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly has said he's willing to resign. Let me tell you what Kelly O'Donnell just heard from the Chief of Staff, which was twice. And this is from the horse's mouth, from John Kelly himself, saying, no, he did not offer to resign. And when she pushed him, he said again, I just said no. So that is an on-the-record denial that he has offered to resign. Now, I will tell you that when I spoke with a source close to the Chief of Staff, I was told, listen, he's always willing to resign. And that jives with what John Kelly has said ever since he came into office, which is that he serves at the pleasure of the president. A second source saying if the president were to say, hey, I don't want you to serve anymore, John Kelly has been in the military. He knows how the structure and how the command system works. That is something he would obviously listen to. I'm told he's feeling irritated right now. That is his mood, because he feels dogged by these continued questions about the fallout from this Porter scandal. As one person put it to me, he feels like, hey, he's answered a lot of questions about this. Why does he still keep getting questions about how he handled this when he feels like he's put it to rest, looking to move past this? You talk about the vibe. It's been an interesting few hours here, because remember, yes, the press secretary is on a pre-planned day off. We saw a lot of sort of huddling of aides behind closed doors, doors that aren't normally closed for these prolonged periods of time. At points, you had aides who sit just outside these offices, turning up the volume on the TV screens outside to perhaps, it seemed, mask private conversations that were happening inside those offices. So clearly there was some crisis control, some damage control happening, as we have seen John Kelly in and out of an area where reporters can go inside the West Wing called Upper Press, and that is where NBC News had the opportunity to talk with him a couple of times. And he clarified the timeline of when he found out. He said he was first aware of investigations, he said broadly, that something was up in November. But he said literally all he heard, and I'm paraphrasing here, was that there was something being looked into. He said he didn't find out that the allegations were true, he says, until Tuesday night. And he said within 40 minutes, Rob Porter was gone. That raises some questions, though, because the timeline is a little confusing. Tuesday night, remember, is when the White House put out a statement saying from John Kelly that Rob Porter was a man of true integrity. So there are still some questions that we are working to drill down on. But the bottom line seems to be, Chris, people at this White House knew about what was going on with Rob Porter and these allegations against him. We have one White House staffer who says, yes, Don McGahn knew, the White House counsel, about a year ago. And so that is sort of where this conversation has been going today. But again, you asked about the mood. Definitely one of those Friday nights where you're like, all right, we might be here till midnight.
Let's talk about it as if it were a normal president and normal White House staff. I know that's a hell of a leap, but let's try that. A president of the United States expects his chief of staff, whoever it is, to deal with these kinds of situations, to deal with personnel, to know what the FBI reporting and their full-field investigation has come through with. When they go out and study these people, find out all about them. They go back door to door, every place you ever lived. It's a thorough investigation by the FBI. According to all the reporting I've seen, the FBI was doing its job. As long as a year ago, they were getting indication that there was some violence in these ex-marriages, these former marriages. And wasn't that enough, that information enough to be brought to the attention of the chief of staff?
I assume you're directing that question to me, Chris.
Yeah.
What I can tell you, is that there was indications that this came to light in the fall, that there was word that this was happening, that these allegations had been out there.
9 months to get the information to the chief of staff.
That is what John Kelly told us tonight himself, that in November he discovered, he was told, briefed, he said, about the investigation, but did not get briefed on specifics. Now, is it possible that the counsel, Don McGahn, his office knew about that earlier? Yes. And our reporting indicates that perhaps as much as last year, he was being told about this. There is an open question of whether that trickled up to the top levels.
I've been reading a lot of this reports with the timeline, Hallie, and I'm getting back to last January. This information reached the FBI. And by the way, let's go to Phil Rucker on this, White House bureau chief for the Post. Is there a problem here with the White House being incapable intellectually or emotionally of accepting fact from the FBI? That's their job, to do background checks. John Kelly doesn't go knocking on doors to say how a guy treated previous spouses. The FBI does. You have to rely on the FBI. Are they accepting the truth of the FBI at this White House? Sir.
Well, the problem, Chris, is that there's no clear accountability here. There's no clear timeline. What we have are shifting statements, evolving timelines. This morning, Chief of Staff John Kelly was in a senior staff meeting at the White House, a private meeting, where he told the aides that he wanted them to go tell their colleagues, to tell the lower-level staffers at the White House that he had taken decisive action within 40 minutes of learning of these allegations about Rob Porter. That does not match the public record. It does not match the statements that we had seen coming out of this White House, where there was a concerted, strategic attempt to try to protect Rob Porter, the staff secretary, up until that photograph came out.
Is General Kelly leading a cover-up?
Well, I don't know. I think he would serve himself if he would come out and answer some of these questions deliberately and thoughtfully and really be transparent about what he and what White House counsel Don McGahn and others in the White House knew, when they knew it, when did they notify the president, what were the conversations with Porter. We still don't know, for example, whether Porter resigned and his resignation was accepted, or was Porter fired and terminated. We've had conflicting accounts from the White House on that point.
Okay. You know, again, Jason, you put the shoe on the other foot and you go, suppose Barack Obama had something. I constantly go back and check this. Suppose he had involved with any of this stuff with the adult dancer or whatever. Right. Imagine if somebody in his top staff had been accused of this, on the record with police records and restraining orders, and the top person in charge of controlling all his paperwork and everything, and then it looked like his people covered up for it.
it would be inexcusable. I mean, he would be pilloried. People would be screaming for his impeachment. What galls me about this is General Kelly talking to the American public and talking to journalists like we're supposed to believe he's a dunce. This is a smart man. This is the guy who has cleaned up a lot of things in the White House. For us to believe that he didn't know for 9 months and then suddenly decided to take action once he saw pictures, that's the most unbelievable part of the story. It is a cover.
Let me go back to Hallie about the culture. Talk about it, because you know the culture there. Is it so much a he culture that they can't deal with a her question? Because I thought Katie Tur was excellent this afternoon. She said, all I hear are he's and hims and no hers in the account of the White House of what went down here.
So I think that there's a couple of pieces to that, Chris. I think, number one, when you look at the president's statement today, and again, you know, I stick to the sort of the realm of the facts on hand, and the facts on hand are that the president did not bring up the women who have accused Rob Porter of domestic violence, both physical and verbal
Even
abuse.
with pronouns.
I would
no
contrast
pronouns.
that. But let me contrast that, too, with what the vice president said to Lester Holt today in that exclusive sit-down in North Korea, because the vice president said things like, domestic violence is not tolerated in this White House and should not be tolerated in this country.
You just cued it. Let's go to an interview with Lester Holt. As you just said, Vice President Pence said he didn't know about the allegations against Porter, the White House secretary, until he heard about the resignation. So here he is. Let's watch.
I was appalled when I learned of the allegations against Rob Porter. The time that he resigned is when I first became aware of the allegations of domestic abuse, and there's no tolerance in this White House and no place in America for domestic abuse. That being said, I think the White House has acknowledged that they could have handled it better. And Lester, when I return to Washington, D.C., I'm going to look into the matter, and I'll share my counsel with the president directly.
Hallie, one of our colleagues out there with the Times, I think Ashley Parker, actually the Post, she said, how come the vice president's always about a foot outside the loop? I mean, he keeps this decent, this wonderful little respectful distance from the bad stuff going on, and he can always come in a couple days later and say, yes, when I find out more about this, I'll react. How does he do this? How does he keep outside? His office, if you look at the West Wing floor plan, is really 2 doors from the president's Oval Office. How does he do this?
Right. And he obviously spent a lot of time over the executive office building, too. Listen, Mike Pence is the #2 guy in this administration. He is the person that the president can't fire, right, when you look at all of this. And I do think it is illuminative to look at the vice president's response to what has happened. You mentioned Ashley saying directly to him, why do you always seem to be out of the loop on some of these issues? I do think when the vice president says to Lester, I'm going to go back and give the president my counsel directly, don't underestimate that, because the vice president is somebody who talks to the president, who has his ear, and who, more importantly, talks with people here in Washington, allies on the Hill, allies in the conservative community, allies in the donor community as well. I think when you ask about culture, there's one other point here, Chris, which is that the president, and this illustrates his comments about Porter today, you've seen some critics seize on this in particular. The president has repeatedly now shown a pattern of a propensity to side with his allies and not accusers. So you look at the Rob Porter case. You look at what happened. It's an apples and oranges, but with Roy Moore, the president saying, well, Roy Moore denied it, sort of siding with him. This dates back to, as our researchers have pulled up, Mike Tyson back in the early 90s.
And Roger Ailes as well.
Right. Bill O'Reilly is another one.
Yeah, well, let me thank you for that. And by the way, I know you went up to the Eagles parade yesterday, and I'm so glad you represented us there.
It was awesome.
So was it 700,000 people there?
Forgive me the day off, but it was totally worth it.
Well, you sacrificed for your country. Thank you so much, giving up a day. I want to go to Phil Rucker of the Post on this. Phil, what about your colleague getting that amazing conversation going with the vice president? How come you're always a foot beyond the loop of reality?
She's brilliant, Ashley Parker. I wish she were here in Washington, because she'd be teaming up with us to cover all of this White House drama. She does it better than anybody else, but she's out there in South Korea trying to keep the vice president accountable.
Thank you. So what a great colleague you are. Meanwhile, the White House staff drama played on in a reality game show. Omarosa Manigault rose to fame, of course, on Trump's reality show, The Apprentice, before working in the White House briefly. She once said this about her former boss, Trump.
Every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump. It's everyone who's ever doubted Donald, whoever disagreed, whoever challenged him. It is the ultimate revenge to become the most powerful man in the universe.
In a world. Anyway, that's what that sounded like. That was her then. Here she is now.
Should we be worried? Don't say that. No. Because we are worried, but I need you to say, no, it's going to be okay.
No, it's going to not be okay. It's not. So bad.
Would you vote for him again?
God, no. Never. In a million years, never.
God, from biblical epic down to soap opera, but she's now going turn 180 on this guy.
I tell you, life comes at you fast, right? You know, just a year ago, he was the greatest guy on the planet. Look, Omarosa, personally, nice person, but she's trying to sell books. Yeah. Okay, all of this, now he's the most dangerous person on the face of the planet. Now I'm so concerned. You weren't concerned. If you still had a job there, you wouldn't be concerned. And guess what? If you're really concerned about what Donald Trump might do as president, you can go find Robert Mueller. I'm sure he'd like to have a conversation with you.
Well, maybe. Anyway, it's it's something. Anyway, we had to end that segment on sort of a comic relief. Anyway, it is a seriously grim night at the White House. Thanks. We heard that from Hallie Jackson, and what a night it's been at the White House. Anyway, thank you, Phil Rucker of the Washington Post, and Jason Johnson of The Root. Coming up.